So, any discussion of Kenya and the Mau Mau Rebellion and the ensuing British counter-revolution requires context. And the context we're going to be discussing is colonial dispossession and rampant racism. So, we'll start with why the British were in Kenya. And we'll answer with shit, why were the British anywhere? Colonial exploitation of labor, land, and resources. Those resources include things like cattle, coffee, rice, and tea. But it's also important to understand that England was not alone in its colonial exploitation of Africa. Dating all the way back to the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885, Africa had been carved up, as the title indicates, in Berlin, Germany, by colonial powers without inviting any people in any of the African nations they decided to dispossess of their land. Kenya, needless to say, was given to the British. By 1895, the British officially claimed Kenya as a protectorate during the neo-colonial era. And by 1901, a railway connecting Uganda and Kenya that the British used for the export of a lot of the raw materials they were getting from other African colonies was completed, further creating much more interest in Kenya as a colony. As far as dispossession is concerned, Kenya experienced a traditional colonial land grab. And when I say a traditional colonial land grab, it actually looks an awful lot like what took place to the indigenous people of North America, places like Mexico, the United States, and Canada, in that basically the colonial land grab is started by violence, then eventually land seizures, then laws are created by the oppressing class, laws that don't necessarily apply equitably across the entire population, fake treaties are eventually used, and then eventually territories just claimed under written documentation, which is important for us to understand how 7 million acres of land was taken from Kenyans, and primarily from these tribes, the Kikuyu, the Nandi, the Giriama, and the Maasai. These were the four groups that were most affected. The English justified this, and I'm going to read a quote here from Francis Hall, that there is only one way of approving Waikuku, and that is to wipe them out. This led to eventually campaigns that some would call ethnic cleansing. As far as organization is concerned in the colony, a colonial office in London oversaw the local prefectures that all answered to a local government in the capital, Nairobi. There were two types of settlers that ended up in Kenya. The first were South African settlers that could not actually hack it in South Africa, but it's important to note these South African settlers. South Africa was also a British colony, and the fact that these British citizens, more or less, or British colonists couldn't hack it in South Africa says quite a bit about their inability to even be good settlers or good colonists. It's also important to note that by getting their teeth cut in South Africa, they entered into Kenya with wildly racist views already because of their experience in things like the Zulu Wars and later on the Boer Wars. The other group of settlers that England attempted to fill Kenya with were basically elites from England that could not, again, just like the settlers coming from South Africa, could not necessarily hack it, but in this case, couldn't hack it in England. These were elites that were, for whatever reason, caught beneath a glass ceiling. They could not actually exert the power of their family name because of limited land, limited resources, or in some cases even limited titles. So they ended up moving to Kenya during this period of time as well. There were 4 legal regulations that the colonial government implemented in Kenya to force repression and assimilation during this period between basically the start of the 20th century and the 1950s. The first of these legal regulations was the creation of reserves, or reading between the lines, they were creating reservations. And again, clearly learning from their compatriots in places like Australia, the United States, and New Zealand in the way to dispossess indigenous people from their land. They also implemented these things called hut and poll taxes, which usually equated to about 2 months' full wages for a Kenyan laborer. So essentially, any time a Kenyan decided to build a hut, they were taxed by the British. And the poll tax was literally, they were being taxed for existing, by basically each person paid a tax for existing. They also issued these things called kipande, which were basically ID cards. And these ID cards were meant to track movement, employment, finger groups, what ethnic group a person was a member of, and they were forced to wear them around their collar, basically like a necklace. And these ID cards had to be always worn around the neck, and Kenyans were always subject at checkpoints or by any British official to reveal their identification, which seriously compromised the prior freedoms of indigenous people in Kenya. They were not used to systems like this. Identification is used more often for repressive measures than it is to engage in society, in civil society, in any progressive or positive ways. They also sought to control the indigenous Kenyans through, essentially, if Kenyans were allowed to keep any of their land, they were only allowed to grow things on that land for subsistence, things like food or other crops, but nothing that could be turned into a commodity and thus compete in the market with British settlers. Land privatization at this time also led to violent seizures, and the Kikuyu were forced basically to work on the land of white people for wages, which essentially, once you dispossess the Kenyans of their land, forcing them onto these reserves, and then, of course, busing them in from the reserves or moving them in from the reserves to work on settler land is clear exploitation of labor. The only thing that keeps it from being full-blown slavery is the implementation of very, 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 very low wages, which is important. Kenyans were also not given any sort of formalized labor rights, as was common back in the UK at the time for British labor. And it's important to understand that any sort of organization or any form of resistance by Kenyan labor was met with violence even before the Mau Mau Rebellion. So things like flogging, whipping, things that we'd be familiar with in a slave-based society. To give an example of how bad land dispossession got for the Kenyan people, Nyanza province was a province in which 30,000 whites owned 12,000 square miles of land. In contrast, 1.2 million Kikuyu had to share only 2,000 square miles of land. That's how inequitable land dispossession, or how land dispossession created such vast inequity in Kenya. There's also a cultural problem that was tied to this. Rich within, specifically the Kikuyu heritage and culture, was land. Land was everything. It was part of the people. It was part of the culture. It also was a symbol of wealth, of status, and essentially, by removing the Kikuyu from the land, they were stealing, the British in this case, were stealing portions not just of the culture, but individuals' identity and their status within society, not only among their peers, but themselves. When looking in the mirror, a Kikuyu cannot be a Kikuyu without land. Also important to note is agency and resistance began well before the Mau Mau became a thing. For example, these are the forms of resistance and agency that existed immediately before the rise of the Mau Mau Rebellion. First and foremost, many Kikuyu began to squat. Simply put, there was way too much land for even the whites to manage, as we saw with the example of the Nyanza province. And effectively, squatters would end up taking land that the whites could not effectively manage, and the whites, more or less, or at least some of them, allowed Kikuyu to farm this land as long as the whites were allowed to share in some of the profit. Other forms of resistance became more staunch as the 1940s and eventually 1950s wore on. Strikes became very prominent. Kikuyu began to grow the illegal crops they were supposedly not supposed to be commodifying. They began to intentionally overgraze cattle, and they organized, especially when they were forced into labor situations, go-slows, where they intentionally worked as slowly and poorly as possible to hurt the bottom line of the settlers that were oppressing them. It's also during this time that we see the formation of the Kikuyu Central Association. It's led by a man named Johnstone Kenyatta, who will play a very important role in Kenya's development going forward and even in this module. And the important part of the KCA was that Kenyatta wanted to use the colonial channels available under the colonial leadership to address certain problems. In simple terms, he decided he wanted to play the political game of the British to try and make changes that would be positive for Kenyans going forward. The British responded to a lot of these changes by manufacturing chiefs specifically for the Kikuyu tribes and nation, which is important because the Kikuyu were formerly a stateless society that even though they had leadership, that leadership was ever evolving, and importantly was a leadership that was usually shared among elders rather than having a singular, coercive, or oppressive chief, as we would call it in Western society. The chiefs were then, of course, co-opted by the British with material rewards or land rewards to keep order as they saw fit. These chiefs also developed laws, again overseen by the colonial committees, by the British, that basically anybody that broke any of these laws would be forced into labor situations. And it's important to understand that the laws necessarily became much more oppressive in hopes that more people would break them so that the British settlers could get more free labor. After World War II, many Kikuyu, who actually fought on the British side during World War II, came back and expected some positive changes in their lives because of the sacrifice they made for the British during World War II, a war that was certainly not Kenya's. And they came back and received none of the favors that they expected, or in some cases were even promised by the colonial officials. It's also important to note that in a post-World War II society, the United States' growing economy became one of the most important markets for the colonial goods being produced in Kenya. And the British had, this represents just another important imperative for the British to maintain their colonial control over Kenya. The last measure that we want to talk about before the outbreak of the Mau Mau Rebellion was Johnstone Kenyatta, who changed his name eventually to Jomo Kenyatta's formation of the Kenyan African Union, better known as the KAU. And again, this was an enhancement hoping that he could use Western methods of change to coerce, not even coerce, to motivate the British to become a little bit more equitable in their dealings with Kenyans.